August 6, 1945. 31,000 feet above the inland sea. The air at that altitude smells like nothing, sterile cold, thin and sharp enough to cut the lungs of an unpressurized man. Inside the modified B-29 designated Enola Gay, the instrument panel glowed amber and green, needles trembling against their stops as four Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines pulled the aircraft through the pre-dawn darkness at 285 miles per hour. Behind the cockpit, in the bomb bay stripped of everything but attachment points and a single modified release mechanism, hung a weapon that weighed 9,700 pounds and carried a designation no crew manual had ever printed: Little Boy. The men who assembled it on Tinian Island 3 days prior had worn white gloves and worked in silence, measuring tolerances in thousandths of an inch, knowing that the margin between function and failure was narrower than a human hair. Below, the city of Hiroshima was waking, smoke rising from breakfast fires, streetcars clattering toward munitions plants, children walking to schools where they would practice bucket brigades for incendiary raids that had burned 64 other Japanese cities into carbon and ash. The enemy high command, entrenched in bunkers beneath Tokyo, had calculated that the Americans lacked the will, the industry, and the scientific capability to produce what their own physicists had deemed theoretically possible but practically unattainable. They were wrong on every count. What happened in the next 43 seconds would rewrite the assumptions of warfare, geopolitics, and human mortality itself. But the full weight of that revision would not land on Japanese military consciousness until the reports came in, and even then, disbelief would be the first casualties. The path to that moment began not with physics or uranium enrichment, but with logistics, the unglamorous, unfilmable arithmetic of shipping, rail, electrical grids, and factory shifts that no propaganda ministry wanted to photograph because it lacked the aesthetic of heroism. In the autumn of 1942, when American forces were still bleeding in the Solomons, and the combined chiefs of staff were mapping counteroffensives across 2 oceans, a lieutenant colonel named Leslie Groves was handed oversight of a project so classified that its budget line appeared in congressional records as miscellaneous engineering. Groves was not a scientist. He was a civil engineer who had supervised construction of the Pentagon, a man fluent in concrete pour schedules, labor arbitrage, and the physics of moving earth. He understood that the limiting factor in any operation was never vision, it was throughput. The Manhattan Project would ultimately employ 130,000 people, consume more electricity than most small nations, and require the construction of entire cities that appeared on no map: Oak Ridge, Tennessee; Hanford, Washington; Los Alamos, New Mexico. Each site was a self-contained industrial organism, power lines strung across desert and forest, water pumped from rivers into cooling systems that ran 24 hours without pause, machine tools calibrated to tolerate vibration variance measured in microns. The scale was so large that, when DuPont engineers began designing the reactors at Hanford, they had to invent new instruments just to measure neutron flux, because nothing in the existing industrial catalog could detect what they were trying to control. But scale alone does not explain success. The Japanese Empire had scale, factories in Manchuria, labor in occupied China, iron ore from captured Philippines mines. What they lacked was the electrical grid to power precision manufacturing, the rail capacity to move components without breakage, and the cultural tolerance for horizontal communication between engineers and line workers. In American plants, a machinist on the night shift could halt production if a tolerance looked wrong. The loss of 6 hours was acceptable if it prevented a defective part from reaching final assembly. In Japanese facilities, such initiative was insubordination. Specifications flowed downward, problems were concealed upward. When B-29s began appearing over Tokyo in late 1944, Japanese interceptors found themselves unable to reach the American bomber's operational ceiling of 32,000 feet, not because Japanese engineers couldn't design superchargers, but because the metallurgy required to manufacture them at scale had been sacrificed to mass-produce simpler, cheaper fighters that could be flown by undertrained pilots with 30 hours of flight time. It was a choice born of resource scarcity and tactical desperation, and it compounded with each passing month. By the summer of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service was cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft to keep a shrinking number of flyable machines in the air, while American factories were producing B-29s at a rate of 150 per month, each aircraft built to a tolerance stack that allowed interchangeable parts across the entire production run. That standardization was not glamorous. It was accounting, but it was also the substrate upon which strategic bombing became industrially sustainable. At Los Alamos, in a canyon 7,300 feet above sea level where the air was dry enough to crack lips, and the sun painted the sandstone amber every afternoon, a team of physicists, chemists, and engineers had been working since 1943 to solve a problem that had no historical precedent: how to compress a subcritical mass of uranium-235 into a supercritical configuration fast enough that the resulting chain reaction would release energy before the assembly blew itself apart. The weapon design they settled on, a gun-type device in which a uranium projectile would be fired down a barrel into a uranium target, was conceptually simple but required manufacturing precision that strained the limits of American industry. The barrel had to be perfectly straight across 6 feet of steel. The projectile had to fit with a clearance of 0.03 of an inch, tight enough to prevent misalignment but loose enough to avoid binding under acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity. The explosive charge behind the projectile had to ignite uniformly, or the projectile would tumble and the weapon would predetonate, scattering radioactive material across the landscape without achieving a nuclear yield. Every component was a single point of failure. There were no backups. There was no second bomb of this design, because the uranium-235 required for Little Boy had consumed the entire output of the Oak Ridge gaseous diffusion plant for 18 months, miles of piping, tens of thousands of diffusion stages, electricity demand equivalent to a city of 700,000 people, all to produce 64 kilograms of fissile material with an enrichment purity of 80%. It was the most expensive substance ever created by human hands, and it was loaded into the belly of a bomber that could be shot down by a lucky burst of anti-aircraft fire. The crew of Enola Gay did not know most of this. They had been told they were carrying a weapon of unprecedented power, that it must not fall into enemy hands, and that if they were shot down over Japan, they should expect no rescue. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the aircraft commander, had handpicked the crew from the 509th Composite Group, a unit so isolated on Tinian that other bomber crews called them the 509th Country Club, because they flew almost no missions and seemed to spend their days practicing the same repetitive maneuver: a steep climbing turn immediately after bomb release. The crews didn't know why. The ground personnel who loaded the weapon into the bomb bay didn't know why. Even the scientists at Los Alamos weren't certain the weapon would work as calculated, because the only test had been of a different design, an implosion-type plutonium device, and even that test had generated a yield lower than the median prediction, suggesting that some variable in the physics was still not fully understood. Little Boy was, in the most literal sense, an untested prototype being deployed in combat. The margin between success and catastrophic failure was unknown. And because the uranium could not be tested without destroying it, there was no way to know except to drop it. Lieutenant Mariko Tsukada, call sign Compass, had been tracking American bomber patterns from a listening post in the Chugoku Mountains since April. Her specialty was radio direction finding, using triangulation from multiple receivers to plot the azimuth and approximate range of enemy transmissions. She was 24 years old, a graduate of the Electrotechnical Institute in Osaka, and one of 16 women assigned to signals intelligence roles in the Western District Army headquarters. The work was meticulous and unforgiving. A single mistransmission could mean an undetected raid. A single miscalculation in bearing could send interceptors to the wrong sector. She worked 12-hour shifts in a windowless bunker lit by oil lamps, because electrical power was reserved for transmitters and encryption machines, logging call signs and frequencies in a ledger that she would burn at the end of each week per security protocol. The Americans had a pattern. They flew at night. They came in groups of 50 or more. Their radio discipline was excellent: short transmissions, frequency hopping, minimal chatter, but not perfect. Over weeks and months, she had learned to distinguish the signature of different squadrons by the timing of their check-ins, the cadence of their navigators' position reports, the slight frequency drift of their transmitters as they warmed up. On the night of August 5th into the morning of August 6th, she logged 3 B-29s inbound from the east. Not 50, not 20, 3. It was unusual but not alarming. Small formations were often reconnaissance flights, photography runs to assess damage from previous raids. She noted the time 02:15 and the approximate bearing 80 degrees offshore, and passed the information to the duty officer, who decided not to sound the air raid sirens. Waking the city for 3 aircraft was not worth the economic disruption. The factories needed to keep running. The workers needed their sleep. At 08:14, the weapon fell free. For 43 seconds, Little Boy was in ballistic flight, tumbling slightly as the wind at altitude, 12 knots from the northwest, imparted a lateral drift of 300 yards. Inside the bomb casing, barometric switches counted down altitude: 15,000 feet, 10,000, 7,000. At 1,900 feet above ground level, the switches closed. A pulse of electricity fired the conventional explosive charge. The uranium projectile accelerated down the barrel in 6 milliseconds. Collision, compression, supercriticality, and then, for a brief interval shorter than the time it takes a nerve impulse to travel from eye to brain, a sphere of matter at the center of the weapon achieved a temperature of 100 million degrees Celsius, 4 times the temperature at the core of the sun. The energy released in that first microsecond was equivalent to 16,000 tons of TNT, but that number is abstract. What it meant in physical terms was that the air surrounding the weapon was ionized into plasma, which expanded outward at a velocity exceeding the speed of sound. The shock wave, a wall of compressed air moving faster than the propagation speed of sound itself, reached the ground in less than 2 seconds, creating an overpressure at ground zero of 11 pounds per square inch. Every building within a radius of 1 mile was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Wooden structures vaporized into splinters. Stone buildings collapsed into their foundations. Steel frame factories buckled and fell. The fireball, a sphere of superheated gas 1,500 feet in diameter, ignited every combustible material within a mile and a half, creating a firestorm that consumed oxygen faster than the wind could replenish it, generating hurricane-force convection currents that pulled in debris and fuel from the periphery and fed the inferno. The mushroom cloud rose to a height of 40,000 feet in 9 minutes. From the ground, it looked like a pillar connecting earth to heaven. From the air, it looked like a cancer. Lieutenant Tsukada felt the shock wave 30 miles away. It was not a sound. It was a pressure change, a thump in the chest that rattled the teacup on her desk and dimmed the oil lamps for half a second as the air in the bunker compressed and then re-expanded. She looked at the clock, 08:16. She looked at her log, last transmission at 08:12, 3 aircraft, Hiroshima sector. She reached for the telephone to call the Hiroshima garrison headquarters. The line was dead. She tried the alternate line. Dead. She tried the civilian exchange. Dead. All 16 lines into Hiroshima were severed. At 08:30, a reconnaissance plane from the Matsuyama airfield reported that a cloud resembling a thunderstorm was rising above Hiroshima, but visibility was poor due to smoke. At 0900, the first refugees began arriving on foot, workers from the outskirts, farmers from the surrounding villages. They described a flash brighter than the sun. They described buildings collapsing like sand. They described people walking with their skin hanging from their arms like wet cloth. The descriptions were incoherent, fragmentary, impossible. The duty officer dismissed them as shock-induced exaggeration. At 0945, Lieutenant Tsukada requested permission to send a reconnaissance team. Permission was denied. The roads were blocked. The telephone lines were down. There was no reliable information. At 1000 hours, a courier arrived on motorcycle from the prefectural governor's office. He had been 11 miles from the city center when the flash occurred. He reported that Hiroshima was gone, not burning, not damaged, gone. The duty officer asked for clarification. The courier repeated, "The city no longer exists." The officer wrote the report, marked it urgent, and sent it up the chain to Tokyo. It would take 4 hours to reach the Army General Staff. It would take another 6 hours for the General Staff to believe it. In the basement archives of the Naval Technical Research Institute in Tokyo, Commander Asada Tsunyo had been reading American technical journals. Before the war, he had studied electrical engineering at MIT. One of 300 Japanese officers sent to study in America and Britain during the 1920s, when the Imperial Navy believed that understanding Western technology was essential to competing with it. The journals were 2 years old, smuggled through neutral Portugal and Sweden, but they contained enough hints to disturb him. Papers on neutron scattering, papers on isotope separation, papers on high-speed photography of shock waves. Each paper, taken alone, was innocuous. Taken together, they suggested a coordinated research effort far larger than anything Japan could sustain. He had written a memo in 1943 warning that the Americans might be pursuing atomic weapons, and that if they succeeded, the war would end on terms Japan could not accept. The memo had been filed and forgotten. After Hiroshima, it was retrieved. Asada was summoned to a meeting of the Supreme Council for the direction of the war on August 8th. He brought photographs, grainy images taken from reconnaissance flights over Hiroshima on the afternoon of the 6th. The city was a smear of ash. The castle was a crater. The rivers were clogged with bodies. The council members studied the photographs in silence. One asked, could this have been achieved with conventional explosives? Asada said no. A conventional raid would require hundreds of bombers. The Americans had used 3. One asked, could the damage have been exaggerated? Asada said no. The pattern of destruction was consistent with a single point source detonation. One asked, can we build such a weapon? Asada said no. Japan lacked the electrical capacity, the uranium, the precision machine tools, and the industrial base. He paused. He said, we evaluated this possibility in 1942 and concluded it was not achievable within the timeframe of the war. The Americans have evidently solved problems we considered insoluble. The room was silent. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The mechanism of disbelief is not ignorance. It is the inability to reconcile new information with existing frameworks. The Japanese military had spent 4 years constructing a narrative in which American wealth and industrial capacity were offset by lack of will, decadence, and strategic incoherence. The narrative was not entirely wrong. American society was fractious, its politics messy, its cultural emphasis on individual comfort at odds with the collective sacrifice required by total war. But the narrative missed the central fact. American industry was not fragile, it was redundant. When the Japanese sank carriers at Pearl Harbor, American shipyards built new ones. When U-boats sank freighters in the Atlantic, American welders worked double shifts and built them faster than they could be sunk. When B-29s were lost over Japan, American factories built replacements and trained new crews and sent them back. The atomic bomb was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a system that could field, supply, and sustain a two-ocean war while simultaneously executing the largest scientific industrial project in history. The scale was so large that it became invisible, because the human mind is not equipped to intuit logistical volumes measured in millions of tons and billions of dollars. When Japanese intelligence officers looked at aerial photographs of American ports, Oakland, San Pedro, Seattle, they saw ships. They did not see the forklifts, the gantry cranes, the refrigerated warehouses, the standardized pallet systems that allowed a single gang of longshoremen to unload a Liberty ship in 18 hours, while Japanese ports required 3 days of manual labor to unload an equivalent tonnage. They did not see the rural electrification programs that had wired 70% of American farms by 1941, creating a population fluent in electrical systems, capable of maintaining generators and electric motors and radar sets without specialist supervision. They did not see the high schools that taught mechanical drawing and trigonometry to farm boys who would become aircraft mechanics and artillery surveyors. They saw a wealthy nation. They did not see a nation that had industrialized the production of competence. Lieutenant Tsukada received a letter from her brother on August 10th. He was a naval aviator stationed on Kyushu, flying one of the last operational Zeros in the Home Defense Force. The letter was brief. "Sister, we have been told the war will end soon. They do not say how. They do not say what we are to do. Some of the pilots are talking about final missions. I do not think I will take one. I have seen enough. If the Americans invade, I will fight. If they do not, I will go home. Mother will need help with the harvest. Please do not worry for me. I have been lucky longer than I deserve." She folded the letter and placed it in her logbook. She did not believe the war would end. Surrender was not a concept that existed in the strategic vocabulary she had been taught. There would be a decisive battle. There would be a negotiated peace. There would be something other than capitulation. On August 15th, the Emperor's voice came over the radio. She had never heard his voice before. No one had. The transmission was scratchy, the words archaic, the meaning obscured by formal court language, but the intent was unmistakable. The war was over. Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. She sat in the bunker, listening to the static after the broadcast ended, and felt nothing. Not relief, not despair. A kind of hollow disorientation, as though the framework that had organized her life for 4 years had been removed and nothing had yet replaced it. The yield of Little Boy was later calculated at 15 kilotons, 10% higher than the median prediction, but within the uncertainty margins. The yield of Fat Man, the plutonium implosion device dropped on Nagasaki, was 21 kilotons. Together, the two weapons killed approximately 120,000 people in the first week, with an equal number dying over the subsequent months from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries compounded by the collapse of medical infrastructure. The numbers are contested. The Japanese government's official count, compiled over decades, lists 214,000 deaths attributable to the bombings. American estimates at the time ranged from 60,000 to 250,000. The variance reflects not only the chaos of the immediate aftermath, but the difficulty of defining causation in a disaster where the weapon's effects, thermal radiation, blast overpressure, ionizing radiation, killed through multiple pathways over different timescales. A person standing 1 mile from ground zero might survive the initial flash and shock wave, only to die 3 weeks later from bone marrow failure induced by gamma radiation exposure. Were they killed by the bomb, by the collapse of the medical system, by the failure of supply lines that prevented antibiotics from reaching hospitals? The question is not semantic, it is epistemological. The atomic bomb did not simply kill people. It killed the infrastructure that sustains life, creating a zone of compounding mortality where death was not an event but a process. The psychological impact on the Japanese military was slower and more complex than the physical destruction. In the days following Hiroshima, many officers believed the Americans had only one bomb, or that the weapon required months to manufacture. The second bomb on Nagasaki shattered that assumption. On August 10th, the Army General Staff convened to assess whether the Americans had more bombs, and if so, how many. Estimates ranged from 3 to 100. The truth, that the United States had produced enough fissile material for 2 guns-type uranium devices, and one implosion plutonium device, with additional plutonium cores in production at Hanford at a rate of 1 per month, was classified at a level higher than most Japanese intelligence officers could access even if they had been able to penetrate American communications security. They were flying blind, but the lack of information did not paralyze them. It forced a recalculation. If the Americans could drop 1 bomb per week, Japan's industrial capacity would be annihilated within a month. If the Americans could drop 1 bomb per day, resistance was futile. The calculus was brutal and simple. There was no tactical response to a weapon that could destroy a city without warning, without possibility of interception, and without limit on deployment. The kamikaze strategy, trading 1 pilot for 1 ship, assumed a finite exchange rate. Against atomic weapons, there was no exchange rate. There was only extinction. What haunted the Japanese command more than the physics of the bomb was the logistical achievement it represented. Commander Asada, in his final report to the Naval General Staff, noted that the Americans had not only built the weapon, but had delivered it with surgical precision from an altitude and range that Japanese interceptors could not contest. The B-29 that dropped the bomb had flown from Tinian, a distance of 1,600 miles, without fighter escort, without losses, without deviation from its flight plan. It had arrived over Hiroshima at the exact time and altitude required for the weapon to function. It had released the weapon, executed a sharp evasive turn to avoid the blast effects, and returned to base. The mission's success was not luck. It was planning. It was training. It was the product of an industrial system that could manufacture 64,000 aircraft during the war, train 193,000 pilots, and sustain operations across distances that required floating supply chains larger than the entire pre-war Japanese merchant fleet. The bomb was terrifying. The system that produced and delivered the bomb was more terrifying because it could not be countered by bravery or tactical innovation. It could only be countered by an equivalent industrial base, and Japan did not have one. It had never had one. The entire strategic premise of the war, that early victories would create a defensive perimeter the Americans would lack the will to breach, had been predicated on a miscalculation of American industrial capacity and a misunderstanding of American political culture. The shock was not that Japan lost. The shock was the discovery of how large the gap had been all along. In September, after the surrender, Lieutenant Tsukada was reassigned to a liaison office in Hiroshima, assisting American occupation forces with translation and documentation. The city was unrecognizable. The rivers had been dredged, but the silt was still gray with ash. The streets had been cleared, but the rubble was stacked in mounds 30 feet high. The survivors had built shanties from corrugated metal and salvaged wood, creating a sprawl of temporary shelters that stretched for miles. She was billeted in a requisition school building on the outskirts, where the American engineers had set up a field hospital and a water purification station. The Americans worked with a casual efficiency that disturbed her. They did not shout. They did not hurry. They moved through tasks with the rhythmic precision of factory workers, and when something broke, they fixed it immediately, pulling spare parts from crates that seemed to contain every conceivable component. She watched a team of engineers repair a generator in 40 minutes, replacing a voltage regulator that had burned out. They did not consult a manual. They did not call a supervisor. They diagnosed the problem, retrieved the part, installed it, and returned to their previous task. When she asked the sergeant in charge how they had learned to do this, he said, "High school shop class." She did not understand. He explained, "In America, most boys learn basic electrical and mechanical repair in school." She asked, "What if the part is not available?" He looked at her as though the question made no sense. He said, "There's always a part available. That's why we have supply chains." The occupation was not harsh. The Americans were not vengeful. They were almost aggressively friendly, handing out chocolate bars to children, playing baseball with local teenagers, setting up mobile cinemas to show Hollywood films. But beneath the friendliness was a message. This is what you were fighting. This is the scale of the system you challenged. Look at the trucks. Look at the cranes. Look at the electrical generators, the water purifiers, the field hospitals, the ration crates stenciled with production codes from factories in Ohio and California. Look at the casual abundance, the redundancy, the assumption that if something is needed, it can be manufactured and delivered. You fought a war of scarcity against a war of surplus. The outcome was never in doubt. Lieutenant Tsukada did not need the message stated. She saw it in the logistics manifests she translated, in the shipping schedules, in the requisition forms that listed items in quantities she had never imagined. 10,000 blankets, 50,000 ration kits, 200,000 doses of penicillin. She saw it in the casualness with which American soldiers discarded equipment that would have been irreplaceable in the Japanese military: boots with worn soles, shirts with torn seams, canteens with dented sides. She saw it in the fact that the occupation force had more vehicles than the entire Japanese army had possessed at its peak. The disparity was so vast that it ceased to be an economic difference and became an ontological one, a difference in what was considered possible. In her diary on October 3rd, she wrote, "We believed we were fighting a nation of merchants. We believed their wealth made them soft. We did not understand that their wealth was not gold or land but systems, factories, schools, power lines, roads. We believed spirit could overcome material. We were children playing at war against a machine that does not tire, does not doubt, and does not stop. The bomb was not their greatest weapon. It was simply the proof of the weapon we never saw, the ability to imagine something impossible and then build it." She closed the diary and placed it in her footlocker. She would keep it for 50 years, and when she died in 1995, her grandchildren would find it and donate it to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, where it would be displayed alongside charred roof tiles and melted glass bottles, and the shadows of vaporized bodies burned into concrete by thermal radiation. The diary would be translated into 6 languages. Schoolchildren would read it on field trips. Historians would cite it in papers on the psychological impact of strategic bombing, and in the margins of the English translation, some reader, identity unknown, would pencil a single sentence: "They never believed until it was too late." The post-war interrogations of Japanese officers produced a consistent theme: disbelief. Not disbelief that the bombs existed, the evidence was undeniable, but disbelief that the Americans had achieved what Japanese physicists had calculated was theoretically possible but practically unattainable within a wartime economy. The interrogators pressed, "Why did you not consider the possibility that American industrial capacity exceeded your estimates?" The answers varied, but the underlying logic was the same. We measured their capacity by our own. We assumed the constraints we faced, scarcity of skilled labor, electrical power, precision machine tools, were universal. We did not account for the possibility that they had solved problems we considered fundamental. One naval officer, when asked how the Japanese Navy had failed to anticipate the scale of American shipbuilding, responded, "We knew they had shipyards. We did not know they had shipyards that could build a destroyer in 30 days. We did not know such a thing was possible." The interrogator replied, "It was not possible until they made it possible. That is the difference." The technical literature on the Manhattan Project, declassified over subsequent decades, revealed the scope of the organizational and engineering challenges. Oak Ridge required the construction of a town of 75,000 people in a valley that had previously contained 3,000. Housing, sewage, electrical power, roads, schools, hospitals, all had to be built from scratch in 18 months while simultaneously constructing gaseous diffusion plants whose internal piping, if laid end to end, would have stretched from New York to Los Angeles. The diffusion cascades required pumps that could operate continuously for months without maintenance, valves that could seal against uranium hexafluoride without corroding, and gaskets that could maintain vacuum integrity across thousands of connection points. Every component was a custom design. None existed in the commercial catalog. Engineers had to invent them, test them, manufacture them, and install them while the project was already under construction, iterating in real time, designing around failures that couldn't be predicted because no one had ever built anything like this before. The project succeeded not because it was well planned. Early plans were discarded within months, but because it had the resources to fail, learn, and iterate faster than the problems could compound. When a pump design failed, they built 10 alternative designs and tested them in parallel. When a gasket material corroded, they tested 40 alternatives. When a diffusion barrier clogged, they redesigned the barrier and retooled the production line within weeks. The pace was insane. The cost was astronomical. The result was a system that worked not because it was elegant but because it was robust, over-engineered, redundant, and backed by an industrial base that could absorb failure without collapsing. The Japanese, by contrast, had pursued atomic research through a small team at the Imperial University and a parallel effort by the Imperial Navy, both operating on budgets equivalent to a few $1 million and producing theoretical papers but no prototype devices. The limiting factor was not scientific understanding. Japanese physicists understood the principles as well as their American counterparts, but access to uranium, electrical power, and industrial capacity. Japan had no domestic uranium. The electrical grid could not support the power demands of isotope separation. The precision manufacturing base was fully committed to producing aircraft engines and artillery. There was no slack, no spare capacity, no ability to divert resources to a speculative project that might not yield results before the war ended. The decision to abandon atomic research was rational given the constraints. But it was also a confession of industrial inadequacy, an acknowledgement that certain technologies were beyond reach not because of theoretical limits, but because of systemic limits, limits of infrastructure, education, capital, and organizational capacity. The Americans did not have better physicists. They had better logistics. By November, the occupation authorities had established a civil administration in Hiroshima, and Lieutenant Tsukada was transferred to Tokyo to work in the demobilization office, processing the discharge of 3 million soldiers and the dismantling of the military bureaucracy. The work was clerical, forms, stamps, filing. It was also terminal. Each file she processed represented a life redirected, a career ended, a structure dissolved. The officers came in wearing uniforms stripped of insignia, carrying service records that documented ranks and postings but not the decisions, the orders, the moments of authority that had defined their identities. They signed the forms without protest. They asked about pensions, about ration cards, about where they were supposed to go. They did not ask why they had lost. The answer was in the ruins outside the window, in the food shipments from America, in the trucks and the cranes and the electrical generators humming in the streets. The war had answered the question before they could ask it. In her final letter to her brother, written in December before he returned to their family's farm in Nagano Prefecture, she wrote, "The Americans did not defeat us with the bomb. They defeated us with the system that made the bomb possible. We can rebuild the cities. We cannot rebuild the century of industrialization that would have been required to compete. I do not know if this is a failure of our nation or a revelation of limits we did not know existed. I do not know if there is a difference. We were told that spirit would overcome material. We learned that material is the physical form of spirit, the accumulated will of a society expressed in steel and electricity and roads. They had more will. We mistook their abundance for softness. It was strength of a kind we did not recognize." She sealed the letter and placed it in the outgoing mail. She never received a reply. Her brother had already left for home, carrying his discharge papers and a bag of seeds provided by the occupation authorities, part of a program to restart agricultural production. He would plant them in the spring, and the rice would grow and life would continue, because it had to. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima dissipated within hours, but the image persisted, in photographs, in newsreels, in the drawings of survivors who had no cameras but needed to document what they had seen. It became a symbol so potent that it obscured the context, the logistics, the years of preparation, the thousands of engineers and machinists and electricians whose work had made that single moment possible. The bomb was not a miracle. It was the output of a system. The shock the Japanese military experienced was not the shock of a new weapon, but the shock of encountering a system so large, so integrated, so redundant that it could pursue a speculative technology to completion while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. That shock was epistemic. It required not just a recalculation of material capacity, but a recalculation of what was possible, what was thinkable, what could be achieved by a society that had organized itself around industrial production and technological innovation rather than tradition and hierarchy. The lesson was not that Japan should have built an atomic bomb. The lesson was that Japan had entered a war against a nation whose industrial capacity was so far beyond its own that defeat was not a possibility. It was an inevitability that could only be delayed, never averted. Lieutenant Tsukada lived another 50 years. She never married. She worked as a translator, a teacher, a clerk in a municipal office. She watched Hiroshima rebuild slowly at first, then with the same industrial efficiency the Americans had demonstrated because Japan had learned the lesson. By 1960, the city had a new streetcar line, new schools, new hospitals. By 1970, it had factories producing automobiles and electronics for export. By 1980, it was wealthier than it had been before the war. The ruins were gone. The survivors were aging. The memory remained encoded in monuments and museums and annual ceremonies. She attended every year on August 6th, standing in the crowd as the names of the dead were read, watching the doves released into the sky. She never spoke publicly about her experiences. When journalists asked, she declined. When historians requested interviews, she redirected them to others. But in her diary, in entries written late at night when the city was silent, she returned again and again to the question of belief, what the Japanese military had believed about America, about themselves, about the nature of power and the limits of will. The entries were fragmentary, repetitive, circling the same themes without resolution. In one, written on the 40th anniversary of the bombing, she wrote, "We believed because we had to." To disbelieve would have required abandoning the war, and abandoning the war would have required admitting that everything we had sacrificed, the soldiers, the civilians, the cities, had been sacrificed for a miscalculation. Belief was the only alternative to despair. So we believed until the sky burned and the rivers boiled and the evidence became undeniable. And then we had no choice but to see what had always been true. We were fighting a future we could not imagine with tools from a past we could not escape. The archive at Los Alamos contains thousands of pages of technical documentation, but the most revealing documents are the meeting minutes, the records of arguments between physicists and engineers, between scientists and military,